Well, good morning.
Good morning.
I thought of you last Sunday afternoon as I was leaving campus to walk home, and there was suddenly within the trees a murder of crows. And you also reported one from your yard as well. So if I were superstitious, I would perhaps interpret that as a sign. I'm not certain. But what it did inspire me to study some about the crow, and they're extremely intelligent and social birds, I understand, and suffer from the effects of superstition and the association with being rather ominous birds. But what I experienced on campus last Sunday was reminiscent of Hitchcock. Well, thank you for attending today's second discussion of Keegan's work, Small Things Like These. And we had concluded in last week's discourse with Dr. Penter's comment about how, as a writer, Keegan does indeed, in a very subtle way, embed the archetypes and the tropes, but as a writer, very much resists the traditional, conventional development of that archetype or trope. The idea of Bill Furlong as the savior comes not from outside, but comes in, and we never see him become the savior figure who will address this discordia and restore the ordinata concordia. We last see Bill at the doorstep in a very critical posture, because throughout the story he crosses several thresholds and is crossing through doors, and at the end of the story he is standing on the steps of his own door. There is also the trope of the young girl that has been mistreated by the stepsisters and who is set in the corner, so to speak. And there are these associations, these parallels to the archetypes and to the tropes, but never does Keegan permit herself as a writer to develop them in their full, conventional, romantic, sentimental way. Are there any other questions or observations from last week's discussion, lecture, discourse that we may address at this interval? Yes?
I was just a little concerned that the wealthy lady who took in the baby,
Yeah, Mrs. Wilson, yes.
Yeah, Wilson baby. I just felt like she could have a little more. Probably I'm saying that. And she did a lot in studying him and bringing him into the household and everything. It's, I think a lot of happens in a situation like that. There's well helping out a very poor child or something. They do a little, but it just made me feel like she could have made him feel a little more wanted. He never did feel wanted out.
Right.
I think he felt cared for and he appreciated everything she did, but I just wanted her to, and maybe to give him some information about who he was.
Well, and it's also noteworthy that she suffers the effect of a stroke and loses her ability to speak.
Yeah.
And of course, silence is so pervasive throughout the entire novella itself. She does take him as a ward. She does provide funding whereby he can become established in the coal yard. But there is that reserve. And so one wonders in what possession of knowledge she may be. John?
I was thinking about that too. To me, this is a novel that's all about limits. You know, the way I'm thinking of the conversation that Eileen has with Bill, talking about his foster mother, sort of saying she had, in a sense, fewer limits on what she could do because she was a woman of means. And we also see how her Protestantism already makes her excluded enough to have fewer limits than, say, a poor Catholic in the village.
Right.
And for me, it's the small things, sort of the titular motif. Those are the things that actually press the limits of what humans are actually capable of doing. So Bill never does the one grand thing. He just allows himself small things to gradually push those limits. But the social limits here are so constricting. And I think it's part of the author's mastery that she can make us feel what's at stake for Eileen and how Bill's hesitant pushes of these limits, even with his questioning, threaten this equilibrium. And it's a stressful novel because we don't know what's going to happen if he pushes beyond those limits.
And as we discussed last week, John, Keegan as writer writes us and Bill into the subjunctive, into the conditional of there's an opportunity, and whether or not he will cross that threshold, figuratively speaking, and act. She doesn't consider that a part of her province or her gaze at this moment. Her craft is one that I would describe as it's the art of subtraction. It's the art of implication. It's the art of the subjunctive as well. Other questions or observations? Yes, sir.
I thought it was kind of a negotiation between, what's his name? Bill and the world. Because he encountered this girl in the cold shed the first early on. And I don't think he really bought into the lie that the child was put in there in the hide and seek game. But he didn't want to go. He just constantly negotiated what he had, how much he had and didn't have, when the business was falling apart, all those kinds of things. And then that one he has this enlightenment, this whole town saved me when I was a kid. And at that point, he went back and got the girl out, got her shed again. And, if they went, and I don't know what his wife's going to say to him when he knocks on the door and says, well, honey, look what I brought home.
And that's where we end. Yes, exactly. At the threshold. Yes, Carol?
I thought he would point out to his wife that he himself had been an orphan, and then she would be all right. That's my opinion.
Yeah. Well, there's just this wonderful mystery of the end. And I was very excited this week to discover some research that has been done in comparing Keegan and the influence of Flannery O'Connor upon her craft. You can imagine how excited I got. It was a wonderful epiphanal moment for me. And what Keegan herself says is it's what's not said. It's allowing mystery to have a voice. And that is so very much a part of the canon of O'Connor. So, we shall begin. The title that I've given for today's lecture and discussion is Between the Idea and the Reality Falls the Shadow. And that is a line from T.S. Eliot's poem, The Hollow Men. And I choose this line from Eliot's poem because of the setting for this novella to be one of a sustained overcast and an absence of bright physical light. There is this suggestion that perhaps, and I speak in the subjunctive, that Bill is moving toward the light. There is the possibility, there is the propensity for this progression to the light. However, Keegan lays down her pen in the final scene, in the conditional, in the subjunctive, in ambiguity. There is this propensity for light, but that is perhaps another story. So between the idea and the reality, the year 1985, on the coast of Ireland, the town of New Ross emerges in what might be described as picturesque antiquity, but the proverbial conjunction. Although there is this suggestion of picturesque ambiguity and this postcard imagery, there is this undertow. There is this web of economic and social tensions, and they are thrumming. And I use the verb thrumming because it is a technique in knitting in which small pieces, small things like these, small pieces of wool or yarn known as thrums are pulled through a fabric to create a woolly layer. Thrums add warmth. They also add bulk to a knitted article by knitting little bits of wool roving. In essence, what happens is what might be perceived as a beautifully, consistently stitched article, by thrumming, by the undertow, by the thrums being pulled through, it changes the texture of the article. And that is how I would describe Claire Keegan's craft, one of thrumming, one of pulling through these more coarse threads into this picturesque setting of a coastal town in Ireland. Because you and I as readers know that New Ross is enduring a grinding decline. Businesses are shuttered. The houses are cold. The dole lines are long. The residents are asking for extensions on their bills that are due. And here, the gift of coal is one that is received quite favorably. It's not as if coal is in the stockings of the children who have been naughty. Instead, coal here is a very valuable commodity in this overcast of winter, this December of crows. Many have left New Ross. Those who have had the means to leave and go abroad to England in search of a livelihood, in search of a life, have departed. So from these elements, the particularities, the incidentals of a simple existence in this setting, a setting that is seemingly on the verge of becoming inconsequential. The 39-year-old protagonist, Bill, is experiencing himself this vague unease, but he cannot articulate what is troubling him. He tells Eileen, "I'm just a bit weary is all, pay no heed." Bill is cognizant of how quickly financial ruin can strike the town. He is aware of how precarious his situation in life is. And he thinks to himself, it would be the easiest thing in the world to lose everything. The times were raw, unquote. Yet, within this setting of thrumming rawness, in the December of crows, we have juxtaposed against the shuttered windows and the long dole lines the description of the convent. And if you have your text, and I'm hopeful that the pagination parallels this edition, movement 4, page 37. Is it a crow? And what we consider, what Keegan has done is, we have been introduced to New Ross, and there is the intimation that it is picturesque antiquity. But then we see the reality. Between the idea and the reality falls the shadow. And in the shadow, the people are standing in long lines seeking assistance from the Irish government. The stores have closed. There is this looming sense of financial ruin under which all the characters move. And now we have a rather postcard description, do we not? Another picturesque description of the convent. The convent was a powerful-looking place on the hill at the far side of the river with black, wide-open gates and a host of tall, shining windows facing the town. Year-round, the front garden was kept in order with shaved lawns, ornamental shrubs growing neatly in rows, the tall hedges cut square. Sometimes small outdoor fires were made up there, whose strange greenish smoke carried down over the river and across town or away in the direction of Waterford, depending on how the wind was blowing. The weather had turned dry and colder, and people remarked on what a picture the convent made. How like a Christmas card it almost was, with the yews and evergreens dusted in frost, and how the birds, for some reason, had not touched a single berry on the holly bushes there. The old gardener himself had said so. That is in very acute juxtaposition, is it not, to the streets that we have traversed with Bill as he makes the delivery of coal. And how very structured, how very linear the design of the convent is. And when Bill goes into the convent and ventures into the garden area, there is this moment when he really has his gaze upon a pear. But no sooner does he go to pick the fruit than these geese raise their wings and hiss at him. It's in a way, it's almost like instead of the cherubim guarding the tree of knowledge, you have the geese guarding the pear tree here. And the fruit is forbidden. Even the birds are afraid to take from the berries. So what is suggested here is this very strict, ominous, very linear design architecturally that is in direct contrast to the decline in the precinct of New Ross. Whatever terrors are thrumming through the Good Shepherd Convent, they remain largely concealed by a code of silence that is enforced by fear, a code of silence that is sealed with the presumption of holiness. And as we discussed last week, there is nothing overtly polemical. There is not this overt critical attack or controversial opinion that Keegan writes in Small Things Like These. Her focus is not on exposing the church as much as her gaze is directed to examining the conscience of a man who becomes in possession of the abusive practices. Bill is placed in an extremely difficult moral posture. He is in possession of knowledge. He has empirical evidence, does he not, that behind these walls of so-called holiness, there are abuses that are occurring. And the first time that he goes into the convent, there is a young girl who rises from polishing the floor, and she asks him to take her to the river so she can drown herself. And Bill just stands there with his hands open, completely unnerved by this request. That's the first intimation. And then when he observes inside during that charade of taking of tea, he is now beginning to become in possession of the knowledge of the abuse. And between the idea and the reality, there is a shadow descending. Before his encounter with young Sarah, who has been locked in the coal shed, Bill has had this introspective moment in which he considers the question, was there any point in being alive without helping one another? Was there any point in being alive without helping one another? I think what is implied by that question is that the purpose of living is to attend to others. It is in that question, you have really, do you not, the definition of altruism. which is the antithesis of solipsism, that the self alone is the only reality. But was there any point in being alive without helping one another? And what I'd like for us to consider now is, now that Bill, with his having encountered Sarah ushers Bill into a new terrain, into a moral terrain. And there's that wonderful moment when Bill actually becomes lost and cannot navigate his way in what heretofore has always been familiar terrain. And he finds himself lost in roads and streets that he has traversed in his role as delivering the coal. And now, in what was once very familiar that he could navigate effortlessly, he is lost. And he stops and asks an unnamed man where this road will take him. And the unnamed man says, anywhere you want it to go. And what you and I as readers infer in that response is that there is choice. There is question. Bill envies the river, which he observes moving in its own incorrigible way. And now the road will go where he wants to go, that he can choose the destination. That's why it's so symbolic that at the end we see him at the threshold. And now, with this response, wherever you want it to go, implicit in that is choice, will, agency. And that's where we find Bill, now in new terrain, displaced in the familiar, and now ushered by Sarah. He is ushering her to his home, but at the same time, she is ushering him, is she not, into a new terrain, a moral terrain, in which he is in possession of knowledge that if it is disclosed, could displace not only him, but his family as well. That is the gaze of Claire Keegan. She does not direct her gaze solely upon the abuses of the church. She is directing her gaze upon the conscience of a man. John.
The understatement of her, this is my page 41, Keegan makes it clear that others are in possession of this knowledge. Right?
Oh, yes.
Others have empirical understanding.
Yes.
And even Bill has heard. But it's so much gossip.
Yes.
And I think what's striking about, haunting about what the man in the woods says, this will take you anywhere you want to go, is Bill has become one of many people who have no excuse, because he's not the only one with this knowledge, but nobody is talking about it.
And I would argue, John, that is one of the insidious currents in this undertow, in this thrumming that is occurring throughout. There is that exchange at the restaurant of Mrs. Keogh. And she is in possession of knowledge of what Bill knows. She's extremely intrusive. But what I think is so frightful and unsettling is that he hasn't told her of his encounter with Sarah, but she knows about his visit to the convent. That insidious current of knowing and inserting oneself into Bill's life. And what's so very dangerous in what she says to him, yes, the order of nuns at the Good Shepherd Convent are different from the order of nuns at St. Margaret's School, where Bill's children attend. But she speaks in what I think is a very frightful generalization. She says of the nuns, they've all got their finger in everything, that they know. And so when you think about it, Jim, what she says there is, it's a generalization, which is an intellectual thought, what an intellect would resist, a generalization. But yet, it's true. And I think it's a part of that insidious undercurrent, that undertow that is pulling at Bill.
I wonder if you could comment. It only comes up once, but it strikes me as you're talking about sort of the insidious nature of what is known and not said. And the way that, you're right, Mrs. Keogh seems to have this knowledge, but we're never told. Early on, Bill talks about his family of daughters as being witches, right? There's this notion of witchcraft, of the sort of feminine mystique of women's knowing, and he seems to envy it and is also afraid of it, which is interesting because this is all about his own coming to knowledge. Why do you think Keegan plays on, I mean, this is an overtly feminist novel in a sense, but she's also drawing on, the witch is this evil feminine character whose knowledge is precisely what gets her, thrown out of the community. But in this case, it's the Mother Superior who's sort of the arch witch, in a sense. I don't know if we're meant to see connections there, but I couldn't help thinking.
Well, I think it's, again, if I can use that figuration between the idea and the reality, we perhaps like to think of those in religious life as living consistently with the vows and being servants and ones who are always willing to extend themselves altruistically, and they don't. They're preserving this insidious equilibrium. They are in collusion with the state. And so, yes, that's another way of deconstructing the ideal notion of the nun who has left the secular world and gone into the convent and is living under vows and in the service of God, who is a bride of Christ. That's completely inverted, is it not, in the hands of Keegan? Because the church and the state, in collusion, they're accomplices in this profiteering. They have, I would argue, they have created, John, their own empire, if you will. And, of course, you and I know that the grammar of the Gospels is in resistance to the grammar of empire. Colonialism, empire, grammar, it fractures hospitality. It fractures the grammar of the Gospels. And yet they have abandoned that grammar and have adopted the grammar of capitalism, of profiting. And I think they have in their own way. I think this becomes, I would argue, a microcosm of empire. Yes, there's the British Empire, against which Southern Ireland has declared its independence. But interestingly, within that independent state, they've constructed their own empire, and they're guarding it. Does that stand to reason? And I think that's what she has shown without overtly telling it. Have I answered your question?
Yes.
Sufficiently? Okay. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Well, 2 points. The description of the convent, it's symmetrical and everything, and then the vegetation around it is unnatural. It's shaved lawns, shrubs growing in rows, tall hedges cut square. It's like it's gone beyond trying to control the environment. It's gone to subjugating the environment. And so to me it was like a little visual clue that things are not natural here.
Right.
This is going against the natural order.
Yes.
So that was interesting there.
That's a brilliant analogy, because the subjugation of the flora, that subjugation is repeated behind the walls, is it not? Yes. It's a great analogy. Thank you for that.
Yeah. And then the other point, like where you're going, the door. I got that. I mean, all the doors and everything. But in a way, to me, he has made his own personal, very, very personal choice based on his principles and his morality. And now with this first door, he is coming to the reality of his choice. He has to go in and tell his wife, and then it's like this stepping stone. So small things like these, I make a choice to try and be good, but then I have to face the reality of it. And that is what is left, to our imagination.
And part of taking that small step, the consequences of one small step could become exponential, could they not?
And I think during, you've pointed out several. Bill does note small things all the way through. He watches his daughters at Christmas. He has some tenderness toward his wife and what she is going through. He sees the little boy drinking from the He harks back to Mrs. Wilson and the small things, And then he makes, one person helping one other person in a terrible situation within these larger contexts. It's brilliant.
Well, it is, because all of these small things that he remembers become in their own way exponential, that take him to the point where he can take decisive action, which in itself could have exponential effects for the innocent as well. I think that's what we call the human condition.
Choices.
Yes, exactly. Carol?
I think that the villagers, quite a few of them, knew what was happening in the convent, and that's how one of them warned him, don't get into this, And I'm thinking of the villages in Germany that were next to the concentration camps. Those people were astounded at what had happened when it was revealed to them that these camps were there. But I bet you quite a few of them knew.
It's possible, certainly. Other? Yes?
I think that's what I found most distressing about it, was that conversation in the restaurant. Because I could see for Bill being someone he's not in the upper class. I feel like if that was me, I would think well, all these other people know about it and aren't doing anything. And I'm just this regular person. Why am I getting in the midst of this and going to do something? Because I really don't have that much power to really make a change or a difference. Like I feel like that conversation would have made me be like, oh, I just need to step back and not get into the mix of this.
And Mrs. Keogh, the owner of the restaurant, she profits from this as well, because we're told that the tablecloths and all the linens that go to the laundry come back as if they're brand new. So her sense of place could very much be threatened as well. But the way that she just inserts herself, I find so very frightful within the design of the story itself, because she is in possession of knowledge that Bill hasn't disclosed. It begs the question, how has she learned this? And so it really makes, as if the entire town is in this collusion, is it not? I think there was another hand. Yes?
I don't know if you want to have this question answered next week or if it's appropriate this week, but I'm sitting here and I keep thinking of George Floyd's murder. And it was this little girl that happened to do the video who had no power, but basically changed, and how it's seemingly a lot of people understood what was going on in the community. And it was choice. So I don't know if you want to comment or wait until next week. Are we going to use next week for more of the larger implications?
Well, I think, to your point, what I could say is that telling stories can be very frightening, in that one assumes a vulnerability, an uncurated vulnerability, discloses the truth. But like Keegan, and as I like to think about Bill, and as Faulkner said, when you tell a story, you sit down with unreluctance and you tell it. You tell it honestly, freely, without any concern about what favor may happen for you in disclosing this. But that really, I think, is what is heroic, that someone comes forth with information that is contrary to the popular conventional belief and challenges that with evidence. Someone who has the courage to sit down with unreluctance. When Faulkner writes The Sound and the Fury, he was so despondent from all the rejections that he had received. And he said, I'm going to sit down with unreluctance and tell this story. And I think that's the posture that an artist has to assume, but I think it's also the posture of one who aspires to live a moral life. You sit down with unreluctance. And to sit down in a posture of unreluctance is that you tell honestly, forthrightly, willfully what you know. That's the righteous person. Does that help in what you were thinking? Yes. And for that one individual who happened to have the ability and the wherewithal to film that and to come up against a collective mentality, that's courage. Certainly. I think I saw another hand. Yes?
I was just thinking about this whole notion of everybody knows, and Bill finds that on his own.
Uh-huh.
And he's been prepared for that. But the whole community not telling him who his father is.
Right.
So his search for his father coincides with his search for what's really going on here and what does it mean to who I am.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's really about his identity as much as it is even his morality.
Exactly, and you're very much on point there, and that is where the writer Keegan directs and focuses and sustains her gaze. It's on Bill, the protagonist. Yes, this happens against this background of horrific abuse, but her focus is on Bill navigating his way into this new moral terrain, and he's alone. That's something we have to consider also, is it not? He is in profound solitude here. And to persist knowing that, I think, ennobles him more. Yes, sir.
But if you know something but you don't engage, you can't be taken to court and thrown in jail.
If you know something and don't engage.
In the event.
Right.
And keep your mouth shut, you don't get in trouble.
Yes.
The whole town knew what was going on. They weren't going to get involved because it was a stinky mess to get involved in. It wasn't going to be on them. But he did. He got involved, and I don't know if he stumbled into it, but he had been there and had that done to him before, so he knew what was going on in detail. But once he started touching it and really getting involved in it, disturbed the rest of the people around, because they knew now they got to be honest with themselves sooner or later.
They're all accomplices.
Yes.
They're all enablers. Maureen?
I was just looking at the very last couple of pages, and he does say he realizes he could have been saving his own mother. Sarah is like an example of his mother, and he's thinking, what if Mrs. Wilson wasn't there for her? And for him, as a child, he said, had his mother been in that situation, he could have died or been adopted out, so wherever, and he wouldn't be where he is now with his wife and his children. So it's all kind of, but yet he is alone. He is totally alone.
His mother dies when she's only 16 years old. And he actually remembers the place on the walkway where she collapsed. But you're right. Knowing his own lived experience, his own history, it is somewhat incumbent, I think, upon one to act in these moments. And of course, doing nothing is by far the easier course, but it's not the moral course. It's not the righteous course. Was there any point in being alive without helping another? that question becomes, does it not, the prelude to an opportunity that is fraught with the promise of radical action. However, Bill can hear Eileen's voice, and she says, if you want to get on in life, there's things you have to ignore so you can keep on. But I think when we consider Eileen's statement to Bill, if you want to get on in life, there's things you have to ignore so you can keep on. But I think what that suggests to us is that in getting on that way, Beth, that's not life, that's an existence. Life itself, I think becomes very secondary in what Eileen says. If you want to get on in life, if you want to get on and exist, there's things you have to ignore so you can keep on. I think there's a subtlety here that what Eileen thinks of as life, you and I might think of existence and performing and maintaining the status quo. He's daunted by this decision before him. And the decision is, do I resolve firmly to resist the cruelty? And it's as he considers that question, it's when he begins to envy the river that runs through New Ross, how easily the water flowed its incorrigible way. Bill has to forge a path, or not. We last see Bill, as I said, at the doorstep. He has crossed over many thresholds and through many doors. But now the threshold is not so much at his own door as it is at a moral decision. Grand gestures of generosity, moments of reconciliation, celebration of the Savior liberating the people from the discordia. These are tropes in the narratives of Advent and Christmas. And yes, we can read this novel as a variation on Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, to which the novel alludes. The volume is among the three presents that Bill receives on one particular Christmas. And when he opens the present with the book of Dickens from the library of Mrs. Wilson, it has no pictures. It smells, as he says, of must. And he has wanted his father, he has wanted a jigsaw for Christmas. None of those gifts are waiting for him. He leaves and he goes out into the barn and cries over his disappointment. And then washes his face from the cold water in the trough so that when he returns, he will not look as if he has shown any disappointment. But receiving the Christmas Carol. Now, you and I as readers bring this to that scene. In Bill's innocence, in his naivete, he is incapable of perhaps understanding that this vintage edition of A Christmas Carol would be one that perhaps one would desire to have in one's library. He's incapable in his innocence and in his naivete of really seeing the value of this book beyond the very present moment. But let's look at that scene. It's on page 19. It's one of the flashbacks in Bill's memory. He looked at Eileen unwinding the cord and plugging the iron into the socket, and at his daughter sitting in at the table with their copybooks and pencil cases to write out their letters, and reluctantly he found himself remembering back to when he was a boy, how he had written away as best he could, asking for his daddy, or else a jigsaw puzzle of a farm in 500 pieces. On Christmas morning, when he had gone down to the drawing room, Mrs. Wilson occasionally let them share. The fire was already lighted, and he found 3 parcels under the tree, wrapped in the same green paper. A nail brush and bar of soap were wrapped together in one. The second was a hot water bottle from Ned. And for Mrs. Wilson, he'd been given a Christmas Carol, an old book with a hard red cover and no pictures, which smelled of musk. He'd gone outside then to the cowhouse to hide his disappointment and cry. Neither Santa nor his father had come, and there was no jigsaw. He thought about the things children said about him in school, the name he was called, and understood this to be the reason. When he looked up, the cow, chained to her stall, was pulling hay from the rack, contented. Before going back into the house, he'd washed his face at the horse trough, breaking the ice on the surface, pushing his hands down deep in the cold and keeping them there to divert his pain until he could no longer feel it.
But he saw that cow being contented with what the cow had,
Yes.
and couldn't do the same thing.
Yes. And in my theological imagination, I'm thinking how, in her own reserved, restrained way, Keegan has embedded here, on the Feast of the Nativity, a manger scene, which she does so very subtly throughout the entire novella itself. But to not present himself as disappointed, breaking the ice in the trough, washing his face in the cold water. Yes, John?
This juxtaposition just occurred to me. That cold water, in contrast to the hot water bottle
Yes.
that his true father gave to him on Christmas.
Well, it's another acute juxtaposition. It's like the bare feet of Sarah and the box of shoes as well. Exactly. It's another one of the ways in which these juxtapositions sustains this tension between the idea and the reality, keeping it in the shadow, if you will. Does that stand to reason? Yes. In his innocence, he cannot imagine that this book could be a vintage edition, which you and I would welcome into our possession. Dickens writes his story to challenge the unequal distribution of wealth in Victorian England. Scrooge decides to repent of his miserly ways only when he is confronted with a vision of being displaced and rejected by the world. His desire for redemption is motivated by vanity and his fear of loneliness. And Bill is seeking a meaningful transformation while cognizant that his action could displace not only him, but his family as well. So it is a variation on A Christmas Carol. Scrooge repents out of vanity, of fear of being rejected and alone, of being displaced. And Bill could certainly suffer the same fate. Could he not? How are we doing on time?
25 minutes.
Oh, we've got time?
About 10 minutes.
Okay.
15 minutes.
Well,
20 minutes.
Given I'm quoting from Eliot earlier, I'm also reminded of J. Alfred Prufrock, who said, "There will be time, indeed there will be time." And I think that Prufrock had a different conception of time than reality. I would like to begin by looking at the Mass scene that is written for us on page 74. And in our consideration of this scene, we have textual evidence that as a storyteller, as a writer, Claire Keegan is indeed a master of the understatement of implication and the craft of subtraction. It is by what she doesn't tell that we infer about the religious sensibility of the parishioners in this church in New Ross. Furlong went out to the back toilet then and took up the soap and lathered his hands slowly at the basin and washed his face and began to shave, drawing the blade very close in places, and nicked his throat. In the mirror, he looked at his eyes, the parting in his hair, and at his eyebrows, which seemed to have grown more closely together since he had last looked at himself. Best as he could, he scrubbed his nails, trying to get the black out from under them. With a fresh type of reluctance, he then changed into his Sunday clothes and walked with Eileen and the girls to the chapel, feeling the pavement steep and very slippery in places. "Have you changed for the collection box?" Eileen asked the girls, smiling as they were entering the chapel grounds. "Or has your daddy given it all away?" "There's no need for that type of ugly talk," Furlong sharpened. "Have you not had enough in your purse for the one day?" Eileen's smile vanished, and a type of astonishment spread across her face. Slowly, she drew out her purse and handed 10-pence pieces round to the girls. In the porch, they blessed themselves at the marble font, dipping their fingers in, making ripples on the surface of the water, before going on through the double doors. Furlong stood down near the door as they walked up the aisle and watched how easily they genuflected and slid into the pews, as they had been taught, while Joan carried on up to the front, genuflecting and kneeling there where the choir was seated. Some women with headscarves were saying the rosary under their breath, their thumbs whirring through the beads. Members of the big farming families and business people passed by in wool and tweed, wafts of smoke and of soap and perfume striding up the front and letting down the hinges of the kneelers. Older men slipped in, taking their caps off and making the sign of the cross deftly with the finger. A young, freshly married man walked red-faced to sit with his new wife in the middle of the chapel. Gossipers stayed down on the edge of the aisle to get a good gawk, watching for a new jacket or haircut, a limp, anything out of the ordinary. When Dougherty the vet passed by with his arm in a sling, there was some elbowing and whispers then, more when the postmistress, who had had the triplets, passed by wearing a green velvet hat. Small children were given keys to play with to amuse themselves, and soothers. A baby was taken out, sobbing in heaves, struggling to get loose from his mother's hold. Cigarette smoke and some bits of laughter drifted in through the porch from outside, where some of the men always stayed until they heard the starting bell. Before long, Sister Carmel, who taught the music lessons, sat in before the organ and began to play. Everyone but the elderly and the handicapped rose when the altar boys came out, leading the parish priest, whose purple robe swung out behind him at his heels. Slowly he genuflected, with his back to the congregation, before taking his place at the altar. Opening his arms out wide, he began, "In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, and the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with you all." "And also with you," the congregation echoed. The Mass that day felt long. Furlong didn't join in so much as listen, distractedly, while watching the morning light falling through the stained glass windows. During the sermon, his gaze followed the stations of the cross, Jesus taking up his cross and falling, meeting his mother, the women of Jerusalem, falling twice more before being stripped of his garments, being nailed to the cross and dying, being laid in the tomb. When the consecration was over and it came time to go up and receive communion, Furlong stayed contrarily where he was, with his back against the wall. And that, my friends, is what we call writing. Sure. What has she shown us as the congregation assembles for Mass?
The main thing is what they're wearing.
Yes, there is emphasis, is there not, more upon the external. The postmistress, who has just been delivered of her issue of triplets, appears in a green velvet hat. The veterinarian has his arm in a sling, which becomes the catalyst to elbowing and speculation. So much for practicing custody of the eyes, correct? But the gossip, again, there is there not, as we discussed last week, in the scene where Bill goes into the convent, and there is this immediate study in having to improvise, because this is a variation in the script, and it becomes this struggle on the part of the Mother Superior to regain her position of authority and superiority over this unexpected situation, over this improvisation that has taken place with Bill arriving unannounced. There is there not, in this same scene, in the description of the Mass, a comparable design that is rather theatrical and performative. They have their seats, and there is the music, that's the cue to stand, those that are able. What is described here is more, as you were saying, of the external, of the physical movement, of the genuflection, of the sliding in, of the procession. What's also interesting is it really becomes, does it not, more of a study in what might be considered more secular than sacred. And I really appreciate how there is laughter from the porch and wafts of smoke that come from the porch into the sanctuary, certainly. So what she, I think, has very much shown here is that this is more mechanical, more performative, and very much, as you were saying earlier, how very structured, how very manicured everything is, and really does not allow for the natural. The unruly child is taken out. So, again, we see, do we not, this emphasis more upon the theatrical than the more spiritual. Yes?
Just quickly, but when they had somebody dipping their fingers into the holy water, and they were looking at
the ripples.
The ripples,
yes.
And not at why they were even having a blessing. I mean, it's just,
right. And Bill, who, before going to the church, is looking at the mirror and noticing the small things, the part of his hair, the fact that his eyebrows have grown closer together than the last time he looked in the mirror, and how, as he observes the service, makes the decision not to participate in the procession to communion, which I think we can interpret as an early act of resistance, perhaps. And he keeps his back to the wall, literally, but figuratively, metaphorical, depending on where the road takes him, will be where his back will be against the wall again. John?
The brilliance of that image of resistance is, of course, by withholding himself from the communion procession, he is taking on the role of the sinner, of the one who is excommunicated.
Yes.
Not worthy to participate
right.
in the sacred action.
Which is in direct contrast to the gossipers,
right.
Who are speculating about why the vet has his arm in a sling.
But then it parallels his meditating on the stations
Yes.
of the one who takes on the place of the sinners, who is excommunicated, who
Exactly.
yeah.
And I think this is one of the subjects that I want to research and investigate and write further in my engagement with this novel. I think that what Keegan has done is to take the Stations of the Cross off of the wall of the sanctuary and has located them in the precincts and in Bill's, the different stations of Bill's life. We know that he is spat upon. The scene with the son and the mother. So I think what again, and this is so subtly embedded, is that the Stations of the Cross come off the wall from these manufactured, molded images, and they become three-dimensional. And I think that's absolutely masterful and incredibly incarnational on her part as a writer. Yes, sir.
Well, you're finally getting, I was sitting here much of the time thinking, this excellent writer and a literate, super reader of all this, but I love it. And, why she chose a male protagonist.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me you're starting to answer it there when we start talking about, the symbolism and what's going on. There's many more facets, but the choice of a, male protagonist. Women writers, not always certainly, but often write with a woman protagonist.
Right.
I think in this case it's very effective.
Very much so, yes. What Keegan has woven, going back to my opening figuration of the knitting and the thrumming, what she has woven is a narrative for any season. Yes, it takes place in Advent and Christmas, but this is a narrative for any season. And the miracle in this season, in any season, is courage. Writing, art, is a temporal act that is conceived, composed, created, and presented for another's engagement within physical space and time. Writing, creating art, is a temporal act. It is experienced within the physical properties of temporality, time, place, environment, the particularities, the incidentals of setting incarnated in the creation. But the creation that is the result of the work, of temporal work, has the inherent power to liberate us from the strictly temporal and purely topical. That's what she has done. The setting, yes, is 1985, New Ross, Ireland, Advent. Those are the particularities of setting in this overcast environment. But what she has done is, as a writer, is to acknowledge the creation within temporality, but also to show us that the work created, the temporal work, has the inherent power to liberate us from a particular season. This is a narrative for any season, and the miracle is the virtue of courage. I find it fascinating how Advent, Nativity, and the 12th day of Christmas, the Epiphany, how there is the promise of an epiphany for Bill. I think what's also fascinating is how, as a writer, Keegan has taken the liturgical season of the Nativity, but at the same time, there are intimations of the Passion interwoven, embedded, and the Stations of the Cross. And what this shows us is that she understands, as a writer and as a believer, that the Nativity, or I go back earlier, that the Incarnation and the Passion are inextricably related. The passion begins at the moment the fiat is pronounced. And that's the terrain in which she is taking us. Not into the strictly linear, going back to your adjective, chronology of a season on the liturgical calendar. She is bringing them into collision. She's not writing into a coalescence. She's writing them into a collision. And I think it's in that collision, in that tension, in that undertow that we find ourselves as readers and as believers. And as I was saying earlier in my earlier comment to John, there is an empire here. It's an empire in which church and state are in collusion. And there is profit being made at the expense of the weak. And I'm going to conclude by quoting another Catholic writer, Joseph Conrad, from The Heart of Darkness, in the opening soliloquy of Marlowe, when he is deconstructing empire. Your strength is an accident arising from the weakness of another.